She woke up that Thursday morning to the shrill buzz of her phone vibrating across the nightstand. It was the kind of sound that made her stomach tighten before she even opened her eyes, the bad news buzz, the kind that said someone needed to ruin her day before the sun was even up. At first, she thought maybe it was work. A last-minute crisis she could at least pretend to fix. But when she finally rolled over and squinted at the screen, she saw her cousin's name lighting up the notifications, followed by her best friend, then a number she didn't even recognize. "Did you see what your mom posted? Hey, I'm so sorry, this is crazy. Call me, now." Her chest went cold. She dragged herself up against the headboard, the bedsheets tangled around her legs, the pit in her stomach growing with every buzz. She opened Facebook, the place she only checked when her mother tagged her in half-baked memes about family values or those blurry birthday collages she always made with old photos she never asked permission to share. But this was different. This wasn't a picture of her blowing out candles at age 12 or sitting awkwardly at a Thanksgiving table. It was a scan. Crisp, clear, perfectly lit, her divorce papers. The same ones she'd signed just 2 days ago, her hand trembling as she pressed her pen to the last page, thinking at least she could keep this private for a while. But here they were, every line, every signature, posted like some grotesque trophy under a caption that made her throat close tight. Sometimes you have to let go of people who don't appreciate what they have. My daughter thinks she's better than family. I guess she wants everyone to know she's divorced now, so here it is. She read it once. Twice. She felt her pulse thrum in her ears, her vision tunneling as if the small, cheap apartment she'd just moved into had shrunk around her. 173 likes. 24 comments. Distant relatives chiming in, "Stay strong, sweetie, family is complicated. So sorry, she'll come around eventually." Others cheering her mother on, people who didn't even know the half of it, who had no clue what it was like to sit across from a man you once thought would be your forever, only to feel like a ghost in your own house while your mother whispered in his ear that he deserved better. She dropped the phone to the bed and pressed her fists to her temples. For a second, she wanted to scream. Or cry. But the tears wouldn't come, not yet. Instead, she sat there in the early dawn light seeping through the cheap blinds, the thrum of passing traffic outside, the neighbor's muffled TV bleeding through the wall. The real world moved on while hers had been split wide open for strangers to gawk at. She imagined her mother sitting at her dining room table, the same table where she'd sat a month ago, trying to explain why she was leaving him. Trying to tell her mother about the cold silences, the way he'd dismiss her in front of other people, the nights she lay awake wondering what part of her was so impossible to love. And her mother had smiled that sad, patronizing smile and said, "Marriage is hard. Maybe if you tried a little more." Now here she was, a little more naked to the world, a little more humiliated, her grief turned into gossip before the ink had even dried. She reached for her phone again, heart hammering as she scrolled through the comments. The word ungrateful came up more than once, always in her mother's voice, even when it came from someone else's mouth. She knew, deep down, that she should delete her account. Or at least shut off her phone and get up, wash her face, pretend she could go about her day like normal. But she couldn't move yet. Not until she understood the full shape of the thing her mother had done, how far this betrayal could stretch. In the quiet of her room, the phone buzzed again, lighting up with another message. This time it was from an old friend she hadn't spoken to in years. Is it true he's living with her now? The bottom dropped out of her stomach. She hadn't even known there was more to know. And just like that, the humiliation turned to a new kind of dread, something darker, sharper, waiting to be dragged into the light. She sat on the edge of her unmade bed, the blanket slipping off her shoulders as the morning sunlight grew harsher. The phone felt heavy in her palm, like it had doubled in weight since that first message. She read the text again, "Is it true he's living with her now?" The words blurry from the way her vision kept swimming in and out of focus. She hadn't even known it was a possibility. In the thick of the final arguments, the slammed doors, the signed papers left on the kitchen counter, she'd told herself it would be over soon. She'd find her own place. He'd find somewhere else to go. They'd fade out of each other's lives like two strangers passing on a sidewalk. But now she pictured it, her husband's duffel bag dropped in her mother's hallway, his jacket draped over the back of the same chair where she used to sit every Sunday for family dinners that always ended in some new reason she wasn't enough for him. She called her cousin first. Not her mother. Not him. Her cousin picked up on the second ring, her voice breathless like she'd been waiting for the call since she hit send on that first warning text. "Is it true?" she asked. She hated how small her voice sounded, but the truth was she didn't have anything left to mask it with. Her cousin sighed, a long exhale that made her want to hurl the phone across the room just to break the silence. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "I didn't want you to find out this way. I thought you knew." I mean, it's all over her page. She posted the papers, then she posted a picture of him unloading boxes into the garage. She's telling everyone it's just temporary. That he needed a place to stay while you two sort your mess out. Our mess? She almost choked on the word. It's done. It's over. I signed those papers. She made sure everyone saw that. What does she want from me now? Her cousin didn't answer right away. Instead, she asked the question that had been scratching at the back of her mind all morning. Do you think they, before all this? She wanted to snap, of course not, but the certainty she'd once had, the rock-solid belief that her mother might be cruel, manipulative, petty even, but never that, slipped through her fingers like sand. The nights he'd stay late at her mother's house under the excuse that your mom wanted to talk about the renovations, the way her mother used to brag about how good he is with the bills, the yard, the heavy lifting. The way they'd glance at each other across the dinner table when she was complaining about her work hours, their shared look that always made her feel like the punchline of a joke she hadn't been let in on. She pressed her palm to her forehead, willing the thought to disappear. But it didn't. It sat there, breathing beside her like a second ghost. She realized then that the betrayal wasn't just the post, it was the years she'd spent trusting a version of her family that never really existed. Her mother, who always called him her favorite son-in-law with a wink that now made her want to gag. Her husband, who used to tell her she just wants what's best for you every time she tried to push back on her mother's constant needling. The betrayal went deeper than a Facebook post. Deeper than the comments and the pitying stares she'd see at the grocery store. It was the secret they'd been building right under her nose, the little loyalty they'd found in each other that made her the inconvenient detail they could peel away when they were ready. Her cousin was still talking, but she barely heard her. The edges of her vision sharpened in a way that felt dangerous. The shame that had burned her raw just an hour ago was cooling, hardening into something she hadn't felt in years, anger. She didn't know what she was going to do yet. She just knew one thing, they'd taken enough from her. If they wanted her to stand still while they burned down the last parts of her dignity, they'd be waiting a long, long time. She didn't leave her bed that whole afternoon. The phone buzzed every hour with more messages, half of them from people she hadn't spoken to in years, each one like a small prick, opening up wounds she thought she'd learned to hide. By evening, she gave up on pretending she could answer any of them. She turned the phone face down on the nightstand and let the hush of her apartment swallow her whole. But her mind didn't stay quiet. It slipped backward, pulling her through every moment she now saw with new eyes, moments she'd once brushed off because her mother had called her paranoid, and he'd called her dramatic. Like the night 6 months into their marriage when she'd come home from work late, exhausted and raw from a project gone sideways. She'd stepped through the front door and found them, her mother and her husband, sitting shoulder to shoulder at the dining room table, heads bent over a pile of bills she didn't even know they'd been discussing. She'd stood there in the doorway, bag still slung over her shoulder, feeling like an intruder in her own house. Her mother had looked up first, her expression all pity and exasperation rolled into one. You really should let him handle this, sweetheart. You've got too much on your plate. You know you're not good with numbers. He'd just smirked, that half-smile she'd once thought was charming, before she understood what it felt like to be laughed at by someone who claimed to love you. Your mom's right. I'm just helping out. She'd said nothing that night. She'd convinced herself it didn't matter, that he was just trying to help. But she never asked to be left out, she just wanted to be trusted with her own life. She thought of all the little Sundays when her mother would text her, "Hey, we're having lunch, come over," but when she arrived, she'd find that he'd already been there for hours, fixing something in the garage or having coffee with her mother while she felt like a guest in her own family. It hadn't mattered that she'd told him, more than once, how she felt when they whispered just out of earshot, how it made her stomach turn when her mother would sigh dramatically about how hard it is to live with you sometimes. He'd always brushed her off, said she was imagining it. "You know how she is," he'd say. "Don't take it so personally." Maybe the worst part was how easily she'd learned to believe them. How quickly she'd turned her own discomfort inward, until every sharp edge of suspicion dulled into shame. She remembered how he'd come home late one night smelling like her mother's garden, that specific scent of freshly watered rose bushes that clung to your clothes if you'd been standing outside for too long. She'd asked where he'd been and he'd laughed, told her she was acting crazy. She hated herself for remembering that now. Hated the part of her that had buried every doubt under a mountain of excuses, because the alternative, the truth, was just too ugly to look at. Lying there in her dark bedroom, she tried to tell herself maybe it hadn't been an affair in the way people whispered about affairs. Maybe they hadn't kissed behind her back, or tangled up in the bed she'd bought with her first paycheck. Maybe it had just been the secret bond, a rope they pulled tighter around her neck every time she asked for air. But did the difference even matter? Betrayal was betrayal, whether it happened in a bed or over morning coffee, sealed with smiles that turned her into a joke in her own family story. She pressed the back of her hand to her eyes, the memory stinging worse than the day itself. They'd been stitching this up behind her back for years. And she'd been too busy trying to be the good daughter, the good wife, to notice she was the only one who didn't belong. Tomorrow, she told herself, she'd get up. She'd shower, go to work, keep her chin up when the whispers came. But tonight, she let herself lie there and feel it all, the sharpness of the lies, the ache of being made the fool. Because if she wanted to survive what came next, she needed to remember exactly what they'd done. She almost called in sick the next morning. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror, toothbrush in hand, staring at her own reflection until the steam from her shower blurred the edges of her face. She looked like someone else, pale, hollow-eyed, a version of herself she barely recognized. The girl who'd kept her head down, worked overtime, did everything she could to look respectable, unremarkable, a good daughter, a good wife. And now, there she was, the woman whose divorce papers were plastered across Facebook like a neighborhood scandal. She pressed her fingers to the mirror, watching the steam bead around her nails, wondering if maybe she'd lost herself the moment she'd let them decide who she was supposed to be. She didn't know why she went in anyway. Pride, maybe. Stubbornness. Or the simple fact that staying home meant sitting in her tiny apartment, scrolling through the same hateful comments and sympathy messages until she went numb all over again. So she put on her best attempt at a normal outfit, tied her hair back so it wouldn't look like she'd spent the whole night awake, and walked out the door like she hadn't spent the past 24 hours unraveling. The whispers started the moment she stepped into the office. She heard them before she saw the looks, two coworkers leaning in by the break room door, one of them nudging the other when they thought she wasn't paying attention. Someone she barely knew from accounting offered her a weak smile, the kind you give to a person whose house just burned down. She hated it more than the pity. It wasn't the questions that hurt the most, it was the people who didn't ask at all. The ones who just looked at her with that flicker of satisfaction people get when they realize they have something to talk about at dinner. She wondered how many of them had screenshotted her mother's post to pass around in private group chats. How many of them thought, what did she do to deserve that? By lunchtime, she sat alone at her desk, pushing a fork through a container of cold pasta she didn't even taste. She could feel the hot weight of shame pressing into her chest, her mother's words still echoing through her mind. My daughter thinks she's better than family, The worst part was how familiar it felt, how easy it was to let her mother's voice drown out her own. But the longer she sat there, staring out the window at the street below, the more that shame started to shift. Underneath the humiliation, she felt something else sparking to life, a tiny ember of defiance that burned hotter each time she pictured her mother hitting post, her ex hauling boxes up her mother's porch steps while she sat there, the last to know. She was done pretending she owed them her silence. Done shrinking herself so they could stand taller. If they wanted the world to know her business, then fine. Let the world see what they'd really done, not just the polished version her mother sold for pity and self-righteous claps on the back. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through the messages she hadn't answered yet. There were more than she could count. Some genuine. Some fake. All of them wanting a piece of her pain to feed whatever story they'd decided to tell. She opened a blank note and started to write, not for Facebook, not for her mother's orbit of drama-hungry family friends, but for herself. Every detail she'd buried. Every time she'd kept her mouth shut when they'd twisted the knife. Every look, every whisper, every moment she'd been made to feel small so they could feel righteous. When she was done, she saved it. She didn't post it yet. But it sat there in her phone like a quiet promise to herself. When the time came, she'd speak. And this time, she'd use her own words. The shame was still there. It would probably always be there, a scar she'd carry long after they moved on to the next mess. But now there was something else stitched alongside it, the slow, certain knowledge that the story she'd been made the villain of didn't end where they thought it did. By the time Saturday rolled around, she knew she couldn't stay hidden behind her screen forever. The note on her phone burned in her pocket like a live wire, a tiny flame that made her want to stand up and shout every word she'd swallowed for years. But posting it didn't feel right. Not yet. She needed to see them, needed to watch the lies slip off their faces when they realized she wasn't playing her part anymore. So she drove to her mother's house, her childhood home, the place where the wallpaper still smelled faintly of her grandmother's perfume, where the photo frames lining the hallway were like shrines to a family that had never really existed. Her stomach twisted the second she pulled up at the curb, the porch light flicking on as if the house itself was waiting to judge her for daring to show up uninvited. She almost turned back. Almost. But then she pictured him there, her ex-husband, living in the bedroom down the hall from where she used to sleep, laughing over coffee with the woman who'd posted her heartbreak like a public service announcement. And that was enough to shove her feet out of the car and up the steps, one after the other. Her mother opened the door with a smile so forced it made her skin crawl. "Oh, look who's here," she said, like they were just picking up where they'd left off, like the whole world hadn't seen her betrayal. "Come in, sweetheart. I was just making tea." She stepped inside, the familiar squeak of the hallway floorboards under her boots, the walls closing in with old family portraits, her fifth-grade school picture beside her brother's graduation cap and gown, all those staged smiles that meant nothing now. She found him in the living room, stretched out on the same couch where they used to spend Sunday nights watching movies. He looked up at her with that smirk she'd once mistaken for warmth. "Hey," he said, like this was normal. "You look good." She ignored him. Sat down in the chair across from them both, her mother perched primly on the armrest beside him, like some smug queen holding court. For a moment, none of them spoke. She thought she'd feel small here, in the house that raised her to believe her worth depended on how well she kept secrets. But instead she felt something uncoil in her chest, a steadiness that startled her. "Why?" she asked. One word, but it hit the air with a finality that made her mother flinch. "Why would you do that? Why would you post it? Why would you let him move in? Are you that desperate to humiliate me?" Her mother drew herself up, crossing her arms like she was bracing for a fight she'd already decided she'd win. "Don't be so dramatic. It's not about you. He needed a place to stay. You threw him out, you made your bed. You can't expect me to just turn him away." He snorted, a low, smug laugh that made her want to throw the vase on the coffee table right at his head. Yeah, you always did like to make a scene. I mean, look at you, storming in here like you're some victim. Maybe if you hadn't been so cold all the time. She cut him off, her voice steady and cold in a way that made him stop mid-sentence. Don't you dare. Don't you dare tell me this is my fault. She turned to her mother, her throat tight but her words clear. You didn't do this to protect him. You did this to punish me. You've been punishing me my whole life for not being grateful enough, for not shrinking small enough for you to feel big. Her mother's mouth opened, then snapped shut. For once, she had no snide retort. Her eyes flicked to him, seeking backup, but he just leaned back, arms crossed, that same lazy grin pulling at his lips like he thought he'd already won. You think you're so special now, her mother hissed finally. You think you're better than your family? After everything we did for you? She stood up, the chair legs scraping the floor as she pushed it back. She looked around the living room, the couch, the old rug, the photos on the mantel. Pieces of a story she didn't belong in anymore. I'm not better than you, she said quietly. But I'm done being worse. Keep your secrets, your pity, your posts. Keep him too. I hope you're very happy together. Neither of them moved as she walked out. She didn't slam the door behind her, she didn't need to. The silence that followed was louder than anything she could have screamed. She didn't remember the drive home. She barely remembered pulling away from the curb, or how her hands stayed steady on the wheel even as her heart felt like it might punch through her ribs. The roads were dark and nearly empty, streetlights flashing overhead like distant little witnesses to a life that was finally hers to steer. She got back to her apartment past midnight, the hall lights buzzing as she trudged up the stairs with her keys gripped so tight the metal dug half-moons into her palm. She shut the door behind her, turned the deadbolt with a quiet click, and leaned her forehead against the frame, her breath shuddering out of her like she'd been holding it for years. The place was silent except for the low hum of her old fridge, the faint tick of the wall clock. She looked around, the boxes she still hadn't unpacked, the thrift store couch she'd found online, the pile of laundry she'd been too tired to fold. It wasn't much. But it was hers. No one else's name on the lease, no footsteps echoing down the hall that made her brace for a fight, no mother with a spare key to let herself in when she felt entitled to pry. She dropped her bag by the door and sank onto the floor right there in the entryway, knees drawn up, head resting back against the cheap hollow wood. For a minute, she waited for the guilt to settle in, the guilt they'd raised her to believe was hers to carry every time she put herself first. But all she felt was a strange, tender emptiness, like she'd scooped out something rotten and left a quiet space for something better to grow. She dug her phone out of her pocket. The note she'd written still glowed on the screen, every line a tiny rebellion in the language they'd tried so hard to erase from her voice. She read it once, twice, her thumb hovering over the post button she still hadn't pressed. Not yet. Maybe never. Because the point wasn't proving to the world what they'd done. It was proving to herself that she saw it now, clearly, painfully, honestly, and she'd never forget. The text notifications were still there, too, her mother's last pathetic attempts to twist the knife. You're being cruel. You're tearing this family apart. He has nowhere else to go. You'll regret this when you're alone. She could almost hear her mother's voice behind the words, that syrupy pity that always came with the threat, stay quiet, stay small, or you'll have nothing. She scrolled all the way to the end, then did the thing she'd never done before, she hit block. Her mother. Him. All of them. Gone from her phone in a few silent taps. It felt too easy for something that had weighed so heavy on her chest for so long. But that's what power looked like sometimes, not a scream in the middle of a living room, but a door closed so gently no one could hear it lock for good. She got up from the floor, stripped off her clothes right there in the hallway, leaving the whole week's bitterness in a pile by the door. She pulled on an old t-shirt that still smelled faintly of the life she'd started building before it all fell apart, late nights studying at the kitchen table, pay stubs folded neatly into the wedding savings account they'd bled dry behind her back. She was so much more than what they'd posted. She made herself a cup of tea and curled up on her bare couch, knees tucked to her chest, the steam drifting up like a promise. Outside her window, the city hummed, cars slipping past on the wet street below, none of them slowing for her grief or her freedom. She didn't need them to. She stared at the blank wall across from her, the quiet pressing around her shoulders like a blanket. It should have felt lonely. But in that silence, she found the thing she'd been looking for all along, the peace that comes when the only voice left in the room is your own. She sipped her tea, her eyelids growing heavy. She knew she'd wake tomorrow to the same mess of boxes and unanswered messages. But she also knew this, she'd never again let them write her story in a post they could weaponize for their own comfort. The rest of her life, the true part, would never belong to them again. And for the first time, that was enough.